Good. Are we ready to roll, or do you need to take roll?
I was just saying, once in a while there's seated for today, because the bell just ready, usually where I was in. We are okay for today, okay?
Okay. So pretty good job on the papers. I was fairly impressed. I thought that most of you did a pretty good job handling the argument for your position. What you didn't do a very good job was in managing the opposing position. And so that's one of the things I want to talk to you about today, is that you still need to develop that other side of the argument, or even explain that there may be other ways of looking at this, and then kind of have that intellectual battle where you say that even though we've got this other way of looking at it, my argument or this argument is stronger because of the evidence that's been provided. So what I'd like to do first here is just to kind of give you a heads up. Now, most of you, have you seen your papers? I sent them back to you over the weekend. Most of them came back on Sunday. Did everybody see their papers? You looked at them? Yeah, okay, good. So in looking at your papers, I tried to color code them so that the color coding would show you kind of like the areas of consistency where you're struggling. So let me just explain to you. I'm sure a lot of you saw lots of yellow highlights on your paper. All right, yellow highlights indicate that these are language problems. In other words, you're using conversational language, or you're using language that is not entirely accurate when you're putting your sentences together. So yellow is language level issues, what I wrote on their papers lots of time, weak diction or conversational diction. So yellow would mean language level issues. If you have words that are highlighted in green, those are word choice problems, meaning that the word that you used there wasn't the right word, it was inaccurate, or maybe it was a word that you thought it had this type of meaning, but it really doesn't. If you saw something that was blue, that was kind of a secondary level grammar mistake. In other words, things like parallel structure or the agreement between a noun and a pronoun or something like that. So blue meant that those were kind of secondary grammar problems. Red indicates major grammatical errors, right? Which would be the 4 major errors. Red, I highlighted any subject-verb disagreement, comma splice, run-on sentence, or sentence fragment, okay? So if your paper has a lot of red in it, you've got major grammar issues that you've got to fix. I think everybody had lots of yellow in it, but this is your first paper. I don't expect you to have control over college level English yet, so that's all right. We'll keep working on it. But those grammar issues, right, we've got to do a better job of getting those things under control, because some of you had lots of those errors in your paper. Now, let me just tell you, when it comes to grading these papers, right, and some of the papers, if you did kind of A or B work, I let you know where that paper stood in the ranges of A and B. If you did C work or lower, and not very many people were lower than C work, but essentially, I didn't really put a grade on there because, I mean, a C is average, and this grade doesn't really matter in terms of the whole course anyways. What matters toward the course, the papers really start to count with, contributing percentage to your grade with paper number 2. So just as, a way for me to kind of look at the syllabus here as well, we need to start looking for paper number 2. And I had originally on the syllabus, if any of you have your syllabus, you can look at it with me. But on the syllabus, I had planned on talking about a rose for Emily next time. But because we're going to be short on time, because we went an extra day with reviewing those papers, and I ended up coming down because we had technology problems, I'm going to cancel that reading for A Rose for Emily. All I was going to do in that assignment was just, essentially have you read a paper, read a short story, and we're going to discuss the elements of fiction as they applied there. But we can do that with everyday use. So on Wednesday, when we reconvene, I want to have a conversation with you about that story, everyday use. All right, so that will catch us back up on our sequence of events for our syllabus. So that story, Rose for Emily, if any of you've got time, you should read it. It's kind of a unique story. It kind of explains why this old lady who lives in the South sleeps with a dead guy. So kind of weird in that regard, but it's a good story nonetheless for looking at the elements of fiction and how they play out. But we will discuss everyday use on Wednesday. Any questions about that course scheduling stuff? All right. So let's take a look at a student paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a student paper here on my computer. You should be able to see this in a second. You see that? You see it? Do you see a paper up there? All right. Here's what we need to talk about. All right. Let's take a look at, I want to walk through this paper. I want to show you this student's paper because I think there were some good things going on here, and I think that there were some things that we can learn from in this paper. So I just want you to kind of follow along with me. We're going to highlight some of the strengths and weaknesses here. And look, I'm not doing this to embarrass anybody. I'm doing it because all of you struggled with kind of similar issues. So let's talk about what those issues are and let's fix them. All right. What I find to be good about this paper is that it establishes in the introduction both arguments. And a lot of people, when they were writing their introductory paragraphs, failed to address that the story could be interpreted in two different ways, right? So if I'm writing in your introduction, what about the other argument? What about the, what about the position of, whether she's a deceitful wife or whether it's in social constrictions? You need to make sure that those two arguments are established in that introduction, and this does a good job of it. So if you take a look at this first paragraph, the writer says something like this, right? During the 19th century, divorces and separations were hardly heard of. I want you to see this. There's a comma coordinating conjunction. Here's another independent clause, families stayed together, right? So the punctuation is correct here. In The Story of an Hour, which is also punctuated correctly with the quotation marks around the story, by Kate Chopin, the Mallards are of no exception. The story begins with the learning of Mrs. Mallard's death and how the news had to be spoken in hidden gestures to Mrs. Mallard. As the story continues, we question why the newly widowed Mrs. Mallard is practically jumping with glee at the news of her husband's death. So there's the quick summary, right? We've established who the author is. We've established who the story, what the story is. We've established a little summary of what the main events are, right? We're going to argue about this issue of why Mrs. Mallard is happy her husband's dead. And now here comes the two sides of the argument. The answer might be that she was a victim of a repressive love and marriage, or she never had true intentions with her husband to begin with. In other words, she was a deceitful wife. There's the two arguments. And now the thesis. Kate Chopin's protagonist is actually a victim of repressive love. So there's that repressive love, that repression issue, which establishes itself with that time period, the 19th century social constrictions. So now I see that I've got two ways of looking at it, and this is what the paper is going to be about. Everybody see what's happening here? A really well-controlled introductory paragraph. That looks good. All right, so now let's take a look at the body paragraphs. From the moment the readers learn of Mrs. Mallard's death, Mrs. Mallard experiences many emotions. All right, this emotion thing is a key factor, right? Now, take a look at some of the language here. I'm going to highlight these words in yellow because I want you to tell me or just think to yourself, what do these mean? She went from wordless shock. Did she actually travel somewhere? No. Well, then went from is not the appropriate verb. Had Mrs. Mallard gone through a wormhole or something like that? Had she traveled? No. Again, not the appropriate term. So went and gone, those are verbs that indicate travel. We're not traveling. So let's take a look at this sentence then, and let's look at the argument. All right. So she went from wordless shock to gasping excitement all within a short time period that makes it almost impossible to believe that she was in a marriage at all. All right. Mrs. Mallard had not gone through a phase of a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. Here's something we can learn. Everybody needs to learn this right now. Let's put this in your notes. Whenever you quote from the story, if you put words in quotation marks and you take them from the story, you need to put a paragraph number or a page number in parentheses at the end of that passage. All right, so I didn't tell you to do that before, but we're going to learn this today, and we're going to add this to our things to do for paper number 2. I also want you to recognize what a good job this paper does of blending in and integrating that quoted material. Many of you struggle with this. Many of you would say something like, the story states, and then you would give a quote. This means, and notice what this does is it just blends the quoted material in with the analysis so that we're not having that kind of rigid, the story states, this means. So if you take a look at this again, Mrs. Mallard had not gone through a phase of paralyzed inability to accept its significance as many others had done when they heard the same. She simply wept at once and went away to her room alone. And again, I would say add that page number in there or that paragraph number. Now, if she weeps at once and she goes away to her room, what does that mean? Well, this writer says this proves that the feelings should have been there and that should have been there in marriage simply were not as strong as they should have been. And my point is that, okay, well, what caused that then? The argument is about whether these feelings were caused by the social constrictions of the 19th century, or were they caused by her being a deceitful, conniving wife? And that's why right here I said they could have been derived from the notion that she was pretending to be emotional. This may be an act, right? The writer here needs to establish that these feelings, right, were brief because she wept and it was over. She was done mourning and now she was moving on with her life. In other words, the social constrictions were what built that emotional response. But essentially, other people are going to look at that and say, wow, she had been waiting for this opportunity. She gave people what they wanted to see, which was an emotional wife. But then when she goes upstairs, she's hiding behind closed doors and having a little party. So this is a good example of how we need to develop both of those arguments in there and then show why one is stronger than the other. All right, so this paragraph this paragraph finishes with the feelings that she did have must have been created through experience and time. So experience and time is the argument, right? The 19th century constrictions to leave Mrs. Mallard in the state that she was in. And my point was that is an ultimate assessment, but we need to look at the arguments and kind of play it out and say, okay, how could it be perceived in both ways? And then let's figure out what's the best way to perceive this. So in all these paragraphs, you should be kind of thinking about what are my other options here? How could this evidence be looked at in another way? And you need to make sure you're doing battle with that. So now a nice transition here. A physical exhaustion haunts Mrs. Mallard's body. Her marriage with Mr. Mallard causes her distress. She's young with a fair, calm face. Now look at all this stuff, right? So here's some language that's added into the paper from the story. So take a look at this. She is young with a fair, calm face whose line bespoke repression indicates. Kind of an awkward construction there, right? This probably should have said, instead of taking the she is young, we probably should have written that her young, fair, calm face with lines of depression indicates her marriage put her through so much, right? This right here is not as good of an integration of quoted material as this one up here, what we did with the paralyzed insignificance. I want you to make sure you're seeing this, right? Because I want you to be more of this than this down here. This isn't so good. That one up there was. So it's physically wearing on her face. And then a powerful will like Mr. Mallard's is so overpowering that the will of Mrs. Mallard is beyond repair. This is a perfect opportunity, right? Chopin writes that whole passage in there about wills and about men and women bending other people to their will, right? There is an opportunity to bring up that part of the story and to discuss it, because in this situation, we want to be able to say, Mr. Mallard had all the will. He had the social constrictions, or he had the social environment on his side. Other people are going to look at it and say, yeah, but she says men and women have that will to do that. So both parties can be guilty. Again, it's about, here's the information, provide the analysis of looking at it from both sides, and then kind of conclude that there's one way it's better looking at it than the other. Many of you tried to just go to a paragraph and just say, here is another way of looking at it, but you didn't really refute it. In other words, you talked about what was going on in that type of interpretation, but you really didn't say why it wasn't as strong as another. So here, by the time this paragraph ends, right, Mrs. Mallard felt caged. She does not feel she was, was capable of letting others know that she felt caged. So yeah, she's feeling restricted, but that restriction could be not only from the 19th century social constrictions of her time period, but she could also feel restricted because she's got a guilty conscience, right? That's that thing was coming to get her, right? She's trying to beat it back with her little hands, right? This is, again, offering evidence, looking at it from both perspectives, and showing one side being stronger than the other. I hope you're understanding what I'm doing here, right? So by the time we get down to this part, right, here's one last paragraph on this. Take a look at this paragraph right here. And I want you to notice my comment about at the end, which is this paragraph needs to relate to the thesis, because we see that she has this, the grief came and went. She's talking free, free, free. She's filled with joy. She's living for herself, right? She spent most of her marriage not loving her husband. She cried. She cared for him, just not how he wanted it. At that point, she welcomed her future with open arms. She had an epiphany during her time. She was drinking in the elixir of life. There's a good example. And I'm saying to myself, does that mean that she just freed herself of her guilty conscience, or did she free herself from 19th century social constrictions? That answer to that question isn't spelled out specifically here. So yeah, I could probably interpret from this that that's what she's after, but you need to do a better job of hammering it out, right? It needs to be clear, and it needs to be unwavering in, hey, this is the argument, this is the way we perceive things, there's two different ways of looking at it, here's one way, here's the other way, and this is why this one's stronger. Now, what happens in this paper is now she tries to bring up the opposing viewpoint here. So Mr. Mallard can be seen as a victim, and Mr. Mallard had a face that looked with love upon Mrs. Mallard. He cannot be to blame for not knowing his wife's true feelings. He loved his wife. And then this situation can also be read as Mrs. Mallard being a conniving woman who married under false pretenses. And I'm like, yes, right, there's the counter argument. This is something that needs to be kind of hit on throughout the rest of the paper. And then look how she wraps it up. This information can differ on who the true victim, who the true victim, truly is. And I'm saying, wait a minute, we got to show why that's wrong. We got to show why this isn't a meaningful argument, that this is something that's relevant, but it's not the right way to look at it, because we need to consider the social constrictions point of view. Are you following me on this? Look at what's going on here. Look at the purpose that we have. We establish in that introductory paragraph that we're going to argue one thing because there's two different ways of arguing. You need to hash out the argument on both sides. And look, I'm bringing this up because this is something that many of you did. Many of you thought that you could just kind of pay cursory attention to the opposing argument and that was good enough. That's not good enough. It means that what we need to do is add more to our analysis to show that, hey, there's a different way of looking at this, and this is why this might not be as strong. And again, one of the last things I want to touch on, right, is this cliche down here. Mr. Mallard must be turning a blind eye, right, to his wife's pain. And I get it, right? But he's not really turning eyes. He's not blind. This is more conversational. This is more cliche. We need to be, literal and specific. Okay? So if I had something to say about this paper, I think it does an adequate job of arguing out one side of the argument. What it doesn't do is really do an adequate job of showing that the other argument is out there and it's got weaknesses and faults. I'm trying to get myself back on. You see me now? Yeah, good. All right. So that's a way of thinking about the conceptual ideas in this paper, because when we get to paper number 2, folks, and this is something I really want to hit home today, right? With paper number 2, you're going to be reading a story about a mother and a daughter living in a country home where the older sister comes home from college and with her kind of, a newfound identity, and we're going to see this little conflict over quilts. And this little family spat that takes place here is going to lead to some questions, right? We're going to essentially, what's happening here is that the mother and the daughter who comes home are arguing over who owns their heritage, right? So when you're reading this story, reading this everyday you story, I want you to really focus on what's going on. It may take you a couple times to read it, right? You may have to read it more than once in order to really iron this out in your head, but you need to decide, right? Who's got the stronger argument here? Is it D, is it the oldest daughter who comes home, or is it Mama who's sitting there in this, cabin in the farm field, right? Who's, living a pretty country life. So you're going to see, a conflicting opinion of who owns their heritage. You guys need to iron that out in your head, and then we'll argue about it in terms of paper, right? For paper number 2, we'll decide we're going to support one over the other, but we got to look at both sides in order to figure that out. You understand what I'm after? Okay, good. I mean, most of you did well enough to get through the paper, but we can do more. We can develop this better, all right? So I want to go back to the computer again, just for 1 minute, and just alert you to the fact that we're going to be using these terms starting on Wednesday, right? I'm going to go back to things like plot structure. If you looked at that Rose for Emily story, that paper or that story is written without a plot structure at all. It's just got this, jumping around in time, and there's a reason for that, right? The author is trying to manipulate some meaning. In this story, when we deal with everyday use, we're dealing with a plot structure where we're going to start seeing Mama kind of, visualizing back about, how she anticipates that life should have been and how her daughter should have been, right? We also have to remember that we're reading this story from the point of view of Mama, right? And this is going to influence your interpretation on this, because if the story is written from one character's perspective, of course, we might be sympathetic to that person. But we have to take an objective look. We got to weigh the evidence and figure out who's doing what here. This is a story about characterization. The whole story is Mama talking about her daughters, and the daughter that comes home, Dee, right, is being looked at by Mama in certain ways, and they're essentially going to be, trying to figure out who they are, who owns their heritage. So by looking at this question of characterization, we're trying to find out an answer to this story. The setting of the story is important as well, in that it takes place at Mama's home. It doesn't take place in Dee's suburban city home, right? It takes place in this country, cabin that doesn't even have windows and has dirt floors. So this is going to be important. We're going to look at some of these literary techniques. We're going to look at some of these kind of flashbacks and symbols, and essentially pay attention to the quilts, right? Without even reading the story, what can you tell me a quilt means in terms of literary value? If we're talking about symbols and metaphors and those kind of things, what could a quilt possibly mean? Anybody? Yeah, of course, because where do we build quilts from? Right? Back in the old days, women used to get together. They used to, quilt on the porch. They used to take pieces of clothing. They used to patch those things together. I see a hand up in the back. I can't tell who that is.
April, and who got something said.
Go ahead.
Like a lot of times, like people like who make quilts,
He's saying there's like a narrative component to quilt building, and that it could represent different parts of your own individual identity.
It sure does. And you know what? That's a really good point, because there's going to be, in this story, there are going to be patterns on those quilts that are going to have specific meaning. You need to pay attention to those, right? Okay, what else? I saw another hand.
Yeah, I was gonna add on to and you said how the quilt is like it can be interpreted as you take different things or different elements and put it into one made piece.
That's right. Yep. So now you're looking at, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? That's a good way of looking at it. You're going to look at these individual pieces of quilting, and that's going to be kind of like the individual family members, and essentially who understands their family, who understands their history, who understands what all this stuff means, right? That's what Mama and Maggie are going to be arguing against for D. So that quilt is going to be an important symbol, pay attention to it. When you go into reading the story, go on a hunt, look for these things. When you see this stuff being mentioned, make some notes to yourself, so when we come together on Wednesday, we can just jump all over the specific details in here. Instead of just talking about what happens in the story, we can actually start interpreting and arguing about who owns their heritage here. All right, that's the first question I'm going to ask you on Wednesday is, all right, who do you think deserves the quilts? Is it Mama or is it Dee? Or Maggie or Dee? Yeah, the youngest daughter or the oldest daughter? You're going to have to make that decision based on who you think has a better understanding of their heritage. All right, so that'll be on Wednesday. So, you know, one of the things about this story that I found to be pretty interesting is the title of it. It's called Everyday Use. Whenever you are going through a story and you see that term everyday use comes up in the story, circle it, highlight it, make a note, show what it, you know, that's the key factor in the story. That's what the author is trying to do. She's trying to alert you to the fact that that's an important perspective. And essentially, this whole theme meaning is this is what we're trying to, taking all this stuff and trying to piece it all together in order to determine that, hey, we got a question of meaning here. We need to figure out where's the best perspective to take, right? And this is about heritage. This is about, you know, I think what you're dealing with also is kind of a clash in cultures here too, because Dee goes off to college, becomes educated. Her daughter and her sister and her mother stay home and just do, you know, live a simple life on the farm. And I think what you're going to find is that clash of cultures is going to lead to differing definitions of what heritage means, right? And this is going to be important, I think, to all of us because, you know, our relationships with our family members are going to be similar. We're going to have differences, and we're going to have differences of opinions about how we need to live our lives or what our families mean to us and those kind of things. So I think it's a pretty relevant story. I think it'll be good for our class discussion. So I'm hoping you guys will probably, you know, take the lead on this. You can tell me what you think, you know, the important categories and elements of discussion are, so that you know, you can start building your papers. But again, I want to go back to that formula for writing the papers out, right? As you're arguing this stuff, you know, as you're going through your paper and making your arguments, you've got to be thinking, all right, there's two different ways of looking at this. If I'm bringing up this position about quilts, what does it mean? Does it mean that Mama owns her heritage? Does it mean that Dee owns her heritage? So you got to start placing these into the context against each other so you can compare and actually make an argument that one's better than the other. And I think that, you know, with this story of an hour, it was very short, and the evidence is very limited. We've got a longer story this time where there's a lot more evidence. There's a lot more explanation as to what's going on. So now it's time for us to, you know, to look at a more complex story and come up with some answers and some reasoning. All right. At this point, I want to just tell you, right, that first paper was a pretty good starting place. I usually, when I'm teaching class here at Damon, if I had to teach this course, if I have a first paper due, I usually don't get papers that were that good. So for the most part, I think you guys are in great shape, right? Pretty much ahead of the curve. And that may be for a variety of reasons. And it's not because we're teaching this in a distance learning format, right? I think it's because you guys are working on this every day. You're getting the kind of support that you need. What we can do now, though, is there's an expectation that I'm going to move you faster ahead on the curve. I want you to be developing this paper number 2 into a really strong argument paper. And I'm not going to put any restrictions on page number or page length for this, because I want you to just do your job. All right? I don't care how long the paper is. I just care that you're doing a good and adequate job of highlighting the evidence and showing the different ways of interpreting it and coming up with your explanations that ultimately lead back toward your thesis. If you can do that, I'm assuming that this is going to be a paper that ends up, you know, going out to around the 3 or 4 page mark. That shouldn't be a problem, right? 3 to 4 pages on this. This is going to be, you're probably going to be wanting to limit the amount of evidence that you have so that you can kind of stay under that 3 to 4 pages. But I just need you to understand you're going to be starting to put together, while you're reading this story over the next day or two, you're going to have to start putting together your notes so that you can organize. In other words, you should be asking yourself the question, who owns their heritage? and then making a chart, looking at the reasons for Mama, looking at the reasons for Maggie, looking at the reasons for D, looking at D's friend, looking at all the things that she wants. What do those things mean? How does all this contribute to some kind of interpretation for the text? If you're doing that, if you're actively reading the story, it will help you develop that argument, so that when you're writing the paper, all you got to do is just kind of look at your notes and just say, all right, I'm just going to plow through this particular component here. I'm going to write this in a paragraph there. I'm going to do this as my opposing viewpoint, and so that it all comes together for you pretty quickly and easily. So let me get back to that. I'm sorry you weren't looking at me when I was having that little lecture, because I was getting pretty animated over here. All right, so at this point, I certainly want you to to ask any questions if you've got them of me, but I'm assuming that you might not. So I guess what we'll do is we'll just we'll leave you with a few minutes if you want to begin reading that. You all have access to it, right? Right? And you all have now. Let me see a show of hands. Who did not receive their paper back from me? Anybody? Oh, you didn't? Is there a reason why? Did it just not show up in email?
Show up in my email.
You haven't looked at your email yet?
I have.
You have?
It wasn't.
I sent it to your Maritime email.
Yeah.
Okay, what's your last name?
Ignorant.
Okay. All right. I will resend it. Anybody else not get a paper back from me? It should be, when you get your paper back, it should be lit up like a Christmas tree with all sorts of color coding and all of that stuff, because I want you to see all the different levels of strengths and weaknesses that you've got in there, right? But if you start seeing lots of red, take notice, right? You can't make those kinds of mistakes. You got to fix that stuff. All right, those are primary grammar mistakes. You got to get those under control. All right, any other questions, any other comments, any other problems? All right, that story, Wednesday, you guys are leading the discussion. All right? And here's, Ms. Warren, are you handing out paper copies of that?
Yeah.
All right, so they can begin reading this right now, because we've got a few extra minutes here, right? And you will hear some interesting discussions, I'm sure, between these students about how they're figuring out the meaning of that story.
I think maybe tomorrow, if you don't mind, can I facilitate like a little coffee shop reading circle for us here?
That would be fantastic. Yep. And
Tomorrow, guys?
yep. So that on Wednesday we can just pull all those conversations together and just have it, get right into the interpretation part. So we
You can find the elements of fiction. All right. Well, you want to make sure you're annotating. And every time you find one of these elements of fiction, you mark it down somehow. Have a conversation with the text. You're sitting down with Ms. Walker right now, and she's telling you her story. Ask questions in the margins. Why? Who? What's the point of it? If you see something repeated in the story, circle it. See where it connects. Do any of the elements of fiction connects to one another? All right?
Sounds great. All right. Well, I look forward to this conversation on Wednesday, and what I will probably do is I will make it back down there. Maybe if not this week, I'm just looking ahead at the syllabus, and I see that our midterm exam is coming up, but I want to get that in by October the 7th. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to want to do before that midterm exam to help prep you for it. So I will. I'll make sure I come down there and we have a face-to-face discussion about some of these grammar rules and some of this preparation that we're doing for that midterm exam. But as you know, right, as you're prepping for that midterm exam, you should be writing that paper in phases. You should be doing it in chunks at a time, and not trying to save it for the night before it's due, or the week before the draft is due, or the day before the draft is due. It should be done right as soon as you can start formulating ideas. Right, start writing. Okay? All right, we will see you again on the video Wednesday. Thanks, folks. Appreciate your help today.
Okay,
All right, bye.
bye. Guys, if you want to read this, want me to read with you? You want to